November 7th, 1942. 30,000 feet above the Solomon Islands, Commander Takeo Yamashita adjusted his oxygen mask and scanned the horizon from the cockpit of his experimental reconnaissance aircraft. The morning sun painted the Pacific clouds in shades of gold and crimson, and the engineer's modification to his plane's exhaust system had reduced the visible contrail to almost nothing. Below him, somewhere in that vast expanse of ocean and jungle, American forces were establishing bases that threatened the entire Japanese presence in the South Pacific. Yamashita believed his aircraft was invisible to enemy detection systems, a technological ghost in the sky. What he and the brilliant engineers back in Yokosuka Naval Arsenal could not have imagined was that at that very moment, the rules of aerial warfare were being rewritten thousands of miles away in laboratories and radar stations across the Allied territories. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how Japanese confidence in stealth technology collided with an American innovation so revolutionary it would render entire strategies obsolete overnight, transforming not just the Pacific theater, but the very nature of modern conflict itself. 6 months earlier, Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura stood in the testing facility at Yokosuka, watching the final calibrations on what he believed would change everything. The young aeronautical engineer had spent 3 years developing a revolutionary coating for aircraft surfaces, a complex mixture of iron oxide and rubber compounds that absorbed radio waves rather than reflecting them. In laboratory tests, the material had reduced radar signatures by an astonishing 70%. The Imperial Japanese Navy had given him 20 aircraft to modify, and the results in controlled environments had exceeded every expectation. Nakamura's pride was not unfounded by the standards of 1942. The technology he had developed represented genuine innovation. Drawing on cutting-edge materials science and electromagnetic theory, his team had studied every captured Allied radar system they could acquire, analyzing frequencies and reflection patterns with meticulous precision. They had tested their coatings against the latest Japanese radar equipment, which itself was based on the best intelligence available about Allied capabilities. In every controlled test, against every known radar frequency, the modified aircraft had shown dramatically reduced detectability. The first operational test came on March 23, 1942, when a modified reconnaissance aircraft flew past Japanese radar installations along the coast of Honshu. The radar operators reported detecting nothing until the aircraft was within 8 kilometers, compared to the normal detection range of 40 kilometers. The success was celebrated with sake and speeches about Japanese technological superiority. Nakamura received personal commendations from naval leadership, and production orders were increased to convert 100 aircraft by year's end. But there was a fatal flaw in the entire program, one that neither Nakamura nor any of his colleagues could have anticipated. They were optimizing their stealth technology against radar systems that were already obsolete, defending against detection methods that Allied scientists had already surpassed. The innovation race in radar technology was accelerating at a pace that made 6-month-old intelligence completely unreliable, and the Japanese military intelligence apparatus had no way of knowing how far behind they had fallen. 3,000 miles to the east, in a nondescript building at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a very different kind of innovation was taking shape. Dr. Eleanor Richardson pressed her eye against the oscilloscope display and watched the green trace sweep across the screen with hypnotic regularity. The 28-year-old physicist had been working on the Radiation Laboratory's microwave radar project for 14 months, and what she was seeing on that afternoon in April 1942 would have seemed like science fiction just 2 years earlier. The Radiation Laboratory, known simply as the RAD Lab, had been established in October 1940 with a singular mission: develop radar technology so advanced it would give Allied forces an insurmountable advantage in detecting aircraft and ships. The British had shared their cavity magnetron technology, a device that generated microwave frequencies with unprecedented power and precision, and American industrial capacity had turned that breakthrough into a technological avalanche. Richardson's specialty was signal processing, and she had been working on algorithms to distinguish aircraft from ground clutter, to identify multiple targets in formation, and most importantly, to detect objects that previous radar systems would have missed entirely. The microwave frequencies her equipment used were so much shorter than conventional radar that they interacted with aircraft surfaces in fundamentally different ways. Where long-wave radar might be absorbed or scattered by specialized coatings, microwave radar painted targets with such precision that even minor surface irregularities created strong returns. On that April afternoon, Richardson was testing her system against a target drone that had been coated with radar-absorbing materials based on captured German technology. The previous generation of Allied radar had struggled to track the modified drone, detecting it intermittently at best. But on Richardson's microwave system, the target appeared as clearly as if it had been covered in mirrors. The coating that was supposed to make it invisible had no meaningful effect against the new frequency range. She immediately wrote up her findings and submitted them through proper channels, but Richardson had no way of knowing whether Japanese forces were developing similar stealth technology or whether her discovery would ever have practical application. The report joined thousands of others in the vast documentation system of wartime research, one more data point in an ocean of scientific progress. By July 1942, the first production models of the new microwave radar systems were being installed on ships and at ground stations throughout the Pacific. The SCR-584, a mobile radar unit that could track aircraft with unprecedented accuracy, began reaching Army units in the Solomon Islands. The Navy's SG surface search radar, operating at 3,000 MHz, was being fitted to destroyers and cruisers throughout the fleet. These were not incremental improvements over existing technology. They represented a complete paradigm shift in detection capability. Lieutenant Commander James Fitzgerald stood on the bridge of the destroyer USS Fletcher on the morning of November 7th and watched the newly installed radar operator run through his checks. Fitzgerald had commanded Fletcher since her commissioning 10 months earlier, and he had seen 3 different radar systems installed and removed as technology evolved at a breakneck pace. This latest system, rushed to installation just 2 weeks ago, came with promises that sounded too good to be true. The radar technician from MIT who had supervised the installation claimed they could detect a single aircraft at 100 miles, track it continuously, and even estimate its altitude with reasonable accuracy. Fitzgerald was skeptical. His previous radar had been useful but unreliable, prone to losing targets in rain or sea clutter, unable to detect aircraft flying at very low or very high altitudes. The idea that this new box of electronics could do everything the technician claimed seemed like the typical overselling that accompanied every new gadget rushed to the fleet. But he appreciated having the capability, whatever its limitations might prove to be, and he had drilled his crew relentlessly on using radar information to coordinate with the ship's anti-aircraft weapons. At 9:43 that morning, the radar operator called out a contact, single aircraft, bearing 352 degrees, range 98 miles, altitude estimated at 30,000 feet. The contact was steady and clear, the blip on the screen distinct and unwavering. Fitzgerald ordered the crew to tracking stations, but held fire orders. At that range and altitude, the aircraft could be Allied, and friendly fire incidents were an ever-present concern in the confused skies over the Solomons. High above, Commander Yamashita continued his reconnaissance sweep, confident in his invisibility. His aircraft had been one of the first modified with Nakamura's coating, and he had flown 6 similar missions over the past 2 months without incident. American air defenses had shown no sign of detecting his high-altitude passes. He had photographed supply convoys, airfield construction, and troop movements, providing intelligence that had proven invaluable for planning operations. The Americans, he believed, had no idea he was watching them. The Japanese commander adjusted his course slightly, beginning a sweep that would take him over Guadalcanal before returning to Rabaul. He was making notes on a kneeboard, documenting ship movements in Iron Bottom Sound, when the first signs of trouble appeared. Far below, he saw the characteristic smoke trails of anti-aircraft fire, but they were not the random defensive barrage he had seen before. The shells were bursting in a pattern that suggested directed fire, and they were getting closer to his altitude with each salvo. Yamashita banked sharply and increased speed, climbing toward 35,000 feet. For the first time since beginning these modified reconnaissance missions, he felt the cold touch of genuine concern. The Americans should not be able to target him with such precision at this range and altitude. Their previous attempts at high-altitude interception had been scattered and ineffective, relying on visual spotting and guesswork. This was something entirely different. On Fletcher's Bridge, the radar operator called out bearing and range updates every 30 seconds. The target had changed course and was climbing, but the radar held its lock perfectly. Fitzgerald authorized firing, and the 5-inch guns began sending shells toward the calculated intercept point. The radar provided continuous updates, allowing fire control to adjust aim as the target maneuvered. It was a level of precision that would have been impossible with the previous radar systems. The shells never came close enough to damage Yamashita's aircraft, but the psychological impact was profound. He was being tracked. Somehow, despite all the testing and all the assurances from Nakamura's team, the Americans could see him clearly enough to direct fire with precision. The invisibility he had counted on had proven to be an illusion. The reconnaissance mission was aborted, and Yamashita returned to Rabaul 3 hours ahead of schedule. His report to intelligence officers there was met with initial skepticism. Perhaps he had been spotted visually. Perhaps the anti-aircraft fire had been coincidental, random defensive measures rather than directed targeting. But Yamashita was adamant. The pattern of fire had been too consistent, too precisely aimed at his altitude and position. Something had changed in American detection capabilities. When word reached Yokosuka Naval Arsenal a week later, Lieutenant Nakamura refused to believe it. His coating had been tested exhaustively against captured Allied radar equipment. The technology was sound. The physics were unassailable. If the Americans had detected the aircraft, it must have been through some other means, visual spotting perhaps, or signals intelligence that had revealed the mission timing. But then came another report, and another. Modified aircraft that should have been undetectable were being tracked and engaged with increasing frequency. The pattern was undeniable, and by late November, it was clear that something fundamental had changed. The stealth technology that had seemed so promising was providing no protection at all against American detection systems. The truth emerged slowly through intelligence analysis and captured documents. The Americans had not simply improved their existing radar technology, they had made a quantum leap to an entirely new frequency range, one that rendered conventional stealth coatings almost useless. The microwave radar systems that were now proliferating throughout Allied forces operated on principles that Japanese researchers had barely begun to explore. For Nakamura, the realization was devastating. He had spent 3 years developing technology that was obsolete before it ever reached operational use. The coating that had performed so brilliantly in tests was irrelevant in the face of American innovation. Every hour spent perfecting the mixture, every test flight, every careful calculation, had been rendered meaningless by a technological leap he had not anticipated. But the impact went far beyond one engineer's professional disappointment. The failure of the stealth program represented a broader problem that would plague Japanese forces throughout the war. The island nation's limited resources and industrial capacity meant that research and development had to be focused carefully, with little room for redundant efforts or backup plans. When a technological bet failed, there were no alternatives waiting in the wings. The American approach was fundamentally different. At the radiation laboratory alone, hundreds of researchers were pursuing dozens of parallel research tracks. Some would prove fruitless, but the sheer volume of investigation meant that breakthrough innovations emerged regularly. The cavity magnetron that enabled microwave radar was just one success among many. Proximity fuses, improved computing systems, advanced cryptography, and countless other innovations were being developed simultaneously, creating a technological tide that individual Japanese innovations could not hope to match. By December 1942, the strategic implications were becoming clear to Japanese naval leadership. American radar capabilities meant that surprise attacks were becoming nearly impossible. Aircraft approaching at any altitude or in any weather conditions were being detected far enough away to allow coordinated defensive responses. Ships attempting to transit contested waters were being tracked continuously. The tactical flexibility that had characterized early Japanese operations was evaporating, as Allied detection networks became increasingly sophisticated and comprehensive. Captain Minoru Suzuki, a staff officer at Combined Fleet Headquarters, spent long nights that December studying intelligence reports and trying to understand the full scope of the problem. Suzuki was not an engineer, but he understood operational implications, and what he was seeing terrified him. The Americans were not just winning the radar race. They were integrating their radar capabilities into a comprehensive command and control system that coordinated air, sea, and ground forces with unprecedented effectiveness. American radar installations on Guadalcanal and surrounding islands were being networked together, creating overlapping coverage that eliminated blind spots. Fighter aircraft were being directed to intercept incoming raids with precision that seemed almost magical. Supply convoys were being routed around patrol vessels that had been precisely located via radar. The entire character of warfare in the Pacific was shifting toward a model that heavily favored the side with superior detection capabilities. Suzuki drafted a report that tried to convey the urgency of the situation to senior leadership. He argued that without a comparable leap in Japanese radar technology, the Empire's forces would face increasing disadvantages in every type of engagement. But his recommendations for a crash program in radar development were constrained by the brutal realities of industrial capacity and resource allocation. The materials needed for advanced radar research were the same materials needed for aircraft production, ship construction, and countless other critical military needs. The same engineers who might have been assigned to radar development were already working overtime on aircraft engine improvements, fire control systems, and maintaining the existing inventory of military equipment. There simply was not enough slack in the system to pursue every promising research direction, and radar development competed with dozens of other priorities that seemed equally urgent. Meanwhile, at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Eleanor Richardson was already working on next-generation improvements to the systems that were performing so well in the Pacific. Her team was exploring ways to use radar not just for detection, but for precision targeting, ground mapping, and weather analysis. They were developing smaller, more portable units that could be installed in aircraft, giving pilots their own detection capabilities independent of ground stations. They were researching ways to defeat the radar-absorbing coatings that intelligence suggested enemy forces might be developing. The pace of innovation at the radiation laboratory was extraordinary by any standard. New prototype systems were being tested weekly, and successful designs were being rushed into production with unprecedented speed. American industrial capacity meant that once a design was proven, it could be manufactured in quantities that would have seemed impossible to pre-war planners. By the end of 1942, American factories were producing more radar sets in a single month than the Japanese military would acquire during the entire war. Richardson understood that she was part of something historically significant, though she could not have known how pivotal radar technology would prove to be. Years later, she would reflect on those months in 1942 as a period of almost unlimited possibility, when theoretical breakthroughs were being translated into practical applications with breathtaking speed. The combination of British theoretical insights, American engineering capacity, and the urgent pressure of wartime need had created an innovation ecosystem unlike anything that had existed before. For Commander Yamashita, the implications were more immediate and personal. He continued flying reconnaissance missions through early 1943, but the modified coating on his aircraft was removed after engineers concluded it provided no benefit and added unnecessary weight. He flew now with no illusions of invisibility, relying instead on altitude, speed, and luck to avoid interception. Several of his fellow pilots were lost during this period, their aircraft intercepted by enemy fighters that seemed to know exactly where to find them. The experience changed Yamashita's understanding of warfare in fundamental ways. He had entered the conflict believing that individual courage and superior tactics could overcome material disadvantages. but facing an enemy with technological superiority so overwhelming that Japanese innovations were obsolete before deployment, he began to understand that some conflicts could not be won through spirit alone. The American ability to out-research, out-produce, and out-innovate Japanese efforts represented a form of power that was more decisive than any single weapon system or tactical doctrine. In March 1943, Yamashita was transferred to training duties in Japan, his operational experience deemed too valuable to risk in continued combat missions. He spent the next 2 years teaching young pilots the brutal lessons he had learned, trying to prepare them for an aerial environment that had become increasingly hostile to Japanese aircraft. Many of his students did not survive their first combat missions, intercepted by enemy fighters that had been guided to perfect attacking positions by radar systems the students could neither see nor evade. Lieutenant Nakamura remained at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal throughout the war, his research focus shifting multiple times as priorities changed and resources dwindled. He worked on improving aircraft engines, developing alternative fuel formulations, and eventually, in the desperate final months of the war, on weapons systems that were designed more for symbolic resistance than military effectiveness. The brilliant young engineer who had believed he could make aircraft invisible became one more casualty of a technological race that Japan could not win. The broader impact of Allied radar superiority extended far beyond individual missions or engagements. By 1944, American forces could track Japanese fleet movements with such precision that surprise attacks became essentially impossible. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot in June 1944, where American fighters decimated Japanese carrier aviation, was made possible largely by radar-directed intercepts that gave American pilots overwhelming tactical advantages. Japanese pilots approaching the American fleet were detected while still dozens of miles away, allowing defending fighters to gain altitude and position before engagement began. Similarly, the effectiveness of American submarine warfare against Japanese merchant shipping was dramatically enhanced by radar capabilities that allowed submarines to detect targets at night and in poor visibility. Japanese convoys that had previously been able to evade detection by traveling under cover of darkness found themselves vulnerable to attacks they could neither predict nor effectively counter. The maritime supply lines that were essential to sustaining Japanese forces on scattered Pacific islands were severed with increasing efficiency as Allied detection capabilities improved. The psychological impact on Japanese forces was perhaps even more significant than the tactical advantages. Knowing that enemy detection systems could track friendly forces with such precision created a pervasive sense of vulnerability that eroded morale and constrained operational planning. Commanders became reluctant to commit aircraft or ships to areas where radar coverage was known to be strong, creating de facto no-go zones that limited Japanese strategic options. The invisibility that Nakamura's stealth technology was supposed to provide had been replaced by a feeling of total exposure. After the war ended in August 1945, Nakamura had the opportunity to examine captured American radar equipment in detail. Seeing the sophistication of the microwave systems that had rendered his work obsolete, he felt a mixture of professional admiration and deep regret. The Allied engineers had not simply made incremental improvements to existing technology, they had reconceptualized the entire problem, exploring frequency ranges and signal processing techniques that Japanese researchers had barely considered. In interviews conducted during the American occupation, Nakamura was remarkably candid about the limitations of Japanese research and development efforts. He described a system where individual brilliance and dedication could not compensate for inadequate resources, limited access to global scientific knowledge, and an industrial base that could not match Allied production capacity. His stealth coating had been a genuine innovation, but it had been developed in isolation, without awareness of the larger technological context that would determine its ultimate effectiveness. Eleanor Richardson continued her work in radar and electronic systems for decades after the war, eventually becoming a professor of electrical engineering and supervising graduate research in signal processing and detection systems. She rarely spoke publicly about her wartime work. Bound by security classifications, that remained in effect long after the conflict ended. But she maintained that the radiation laboratory represented a unique moment in scientific history, when the urgency of war combined with unprecedented resources to push technological boundaries at an almost unimaginable pace. When restrictions were finally lifted in the 1960s, Richardson published several academic papers describing the theoretical foundations of the microwave radar systems that had been developed during the war. Reading those papers, Nakamura recognized principles and techniques that would have been invaluable to his own research had he been aware of them in 1942. The divergence between Allied and Japanese radar capabilities, he concluded, was not primarily a matter of individual genius or engineering skill. It was a product of different research ecosystems, different levels of resource commitment, and different approaches to translating theoretical knowledge into practical applications. The story of the failed stealth technology became a case study in post-war analysis of technological competition during the conflict. Military historians and engineers studied Nakamura's work not as an example of incompetence, but as an illustration of how technological advantage could shift with stunning speed when one side achieved breakthrough innovations. The same coating that had seemed so promising in March 1942 was completely obsolete by November, rendered useless by advances that Japanese intelligence had not detected and could not have countered even if they had known about them. Commander Yamashita survived the war and eventually became an instructor at Japan's post-war Self-Defense Force Aviation School. He taught new generations of pilots about the importance of technological awareness and the dangers of overconfidence in one's own capabilities. The morning in November 1942, when he had discovered that his supposedly invisible aircraft was being tracked, with precision remained vivid in his memory decades later. It had been the moment when his understanding of modern warfare fundamentally changed, when he realized that the conflict would be decided not by individual courage or tactical brilliance, but by industrial capacity and technological innovation operating at a scale that neither he nor his superiors had fully grasped. The radar systems that had detected Yamashita's aircraft that morning represented just one aspect of Allied technological superiority, but they illustrated a broader pattern that characterized the entire war in the Pacific. American research and development efforts were not always successful, and many promising technologies failed to deliver on their initial promise. But the sheer volume of parallel research efforts meant that breakthrough innovations emerged regularly, and American industrial capacity ensured that successful designs could be produced and deployed in overwhelming quantities. For Japan, the failure of the stealth technology program was emblematic of a larger strategic problem. Limited resources forced difficult choices about research priorities, and there were no backup options when those choices proved unsuccessful. The engineers working at facilities like Yokosuka Naval Arsenal were talented and dedicated, but they were working within constraints that made sustained technological competition with Allied research efforts impossible. The innovation race was not a fair contest, and by 1943, it was clear that Japan was falling further behind with each passing month. The human cost of technological disadvantage was measured not just in lost aircraft and ships, but in the lives of pilots and sailors who faced enemies with capabilities they could not match. Young men trained to believe in the superiority of their equipment and the invincibility of their spirit found themselves in combat situations where courage and skill were insufficient to overcome material disadvantages. The psychological trauma of that realization affected an entire generation of Japanese military personnel who survived the war. In the decades after the conflict ended, both Nakamura and Yamashita participated in historical conferences that brought together engineers and military personnel from former enemy nations. These gatherings were often emotional, as participants shared experiences that had remained private for years and gained perspective on how their individual efforts had fit into the larger pattern of the war. Nakamura met several of the American engineers who had developed the microwave radar systems that had defeated his stealth technology, and he was struck by how similar their motivations and methods had been to his own, despite the vastly different outcomes. The conferences also revealed how much neither side had understood about the other's capabilities during the war. American engineers had not known about Japanese stealth research until well after the conflict ended, and they had developed their microwave radar systems to solve different problems entirely. The fact that those systems rendered Japanese stealth coatings obsolete had been an unintended consequence rather than a directly planned countermeasure. Similarly, Japanese intelligence had failed to grasp the scale and sophistication of Allied radar development, focusing on incremental improvements to existing systems rather than recognizing the paradigm shift that microwave frequencies represented. Richardson, attending one of these conferences in the 1970s, found herself in conversation with Nakamura through interpreters. The two engineers compared notes on the challenges they had faced, the constraints under which they had worked, and the broader strategic contexts that had shaped their research priorities. Despite the language barrier and the gulf of history that separated them, they found common ground in their shared experience of trying to solve complex technical problems under the extreme pressure of wartime urgency. That conversation, and others like it, helped shape a more nuanced understanding of technological competition during the war. The narrative of Allied superiority remained valid, but it was complicated by recognition of the systemic factors that had enabled that superiority. Individual genius and breakthrough insights were important, but they mattered less than research infrastructure, industrial capacity, and the ability to rapidly translate theoretical advances into practical applications at scale. The radar technology that had changed the Pacific War continued evolving long after 1945, becoming ever more sophisticated and capable. The principles established by Richardson and her colleagues at the Radiation Laboratory became the foundation for entire industries dedicated to electronic detection and countermeasures. Modern stealth technology eventually found ways to defeat radar systems, but only after decades of research that built on the hard lessons learned during the war. For the individuals directly involved in that wartime competition, the experience left lasting impressions that shaped their post-war careers and their understanding of technology's role in human affairs. Nakamura became an advocate for international scientific cooperation, arguing that the insularity that had handicapped Japanese research during the war was a mistake that should never be repeated. Yamashita taught his students that overconfidence in one's own capabilities was more dangerous than the enemy's weapons. Richardson emphasized in her lectures that scientific progress was a collaborative endeavor that benefited from diverse perspectives and the free exchange of ideas. The story of Japanese stealth technology and American radar development became a parable about the nature of technological competition and the dangers of assuming that current advantages would persist into the future. It illustrated how quickly the balance of capability could shift when one side achieved breakthrough innovations, and how difficult it was to counter those innovations without equivalent resources and research infrastructure. Most importantly, it demonstrated that individual brilliance and dedication, while valuable, could not overcome systemic disadvantages in research capacity and industrial production. Decades after the war, historians studying the conflict identified radar development as one of several key technological advantages that had shaped the outcome of the Pacific Campaign. The list included proximity fuses for anti-aircraft shells, advances in cryptography that allowed Allied forces to read Japanese communications, improvements in aircraft engine reliability and performance, and innovations in logistics that allowed American forces to sustain operations across vast oceanic distances. Each of these advantages contributed to Allied victory, and each reflected the broader pattern of Allied research and industrial superiority. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.